Abyssal Murmurs. I would like to share a spiritual story that happened a long time ago. Specifically, in 1944, when my grandmother was still young, just over 20, and didn't know what love was yet. This story was told by my grandmother to the family, and later my mother told it to me. It happened that my grandmother was very close to a friend of hers named Elfleda. The two houses were separated by a small canal in the village of Tyringham, Massachusetts. Before this incident occurred, my grandmother was quite the tough type of person. While she wasn't afraid of ghosts, she simply didn't shout about it like other girls would. My grandmother recounted how one day in the village, a man had recently fallen into the canal and died, having been drunk. While alive, he would often pass by my grandmother's house on his way to the fields, as they were from the same village and everyone knew each other's faces. When they carried his body to the cemetery, they passed by my grandmother's house as well. One night, my grandmother was sitting in the front yard with her mother, sorting through beans, removing the bad ones. She then heard the sound of a man's voice singing drunkenly. As the singing grew closer, her curiosity piqued and she turned to look. She saw a man staggering in front of her house. Thinking it was just someone from the village returning home drunk, she didn't pay him much attention until she heard him call out, "Hey, is that you, Bay?" My grandmother was the third child, so everyone called her Ba. "Why aren't you greeting me?" How rude. Upon hearing this, my grandmother felt annoyed and stood up, intending to scold him. But as she looked closely, she was frozen in shock when she realized that it was the drunk man who had just died in the canal. She described him as having a pale face, soaking wet from head to toe, with water dripping to the ground. His hair was long and matted, leaving just two dark eyes visible. Seeing my grandmother standing there in silence, he smiled, waved for her to follow him outside. Luckily, her mother came out and called for her, which made the man glide away, and she didn't see his feet at all. Later, when my grandmother recounted the event, her mother led her inside, lit incense on the family altar, and prayed for something. The next morning, they prepared a bowl of porridge to offer at the canal for worship. After that, my grandmother no longer saw him. Returning to my grandmother's story with Elfleda, during that time, the two of them often visited each other's homes, sharing a love for watching traditional opera. Occasionally, traveling troupies would come to nearby villages to perform. Nothing significant happened until one day. The two of them set out to the local temple to watch a traditional opera, as the temple had lent the troupe a piece of land to set up a stage. By the time the performance ended, it was nearly 11 p.m. My grandmother and Elfleda hurried back home, engrossed in the show, completely oblivious to the time. As the two grandmothers were running near the canal, a patch of bamboo lying on the ground caught them by surprise. Due to the dim moonlight that night, they were oblivious to their surroundings, just focusing on running. At this moment, Elfleda was ahead, and my grandmother was following closely behind. Just as Elfleda stepped on the bamboo lying underfoot, it unexpectedly stood upright and flung Elfleda into the air before she tumbled down to the ground. Seeing this, my grandmother was terrified and stopped in her tracks, screaming out loud. Fortunately, a few people returning from a traditional theater performance were heading in their direction. Hearing my grandmother's scream, they rushed over to ask what had happened and found Elfleda lying unconscious on the ground. My grandmother explained the situation, and everyone chimed in, saying that the bamboo patch had been haunted by a spirit for as long as anyone could remember. In this area, few dared to walk past that bamboo patch at night unless they were in a large group for safety. Upon hearing this, my grandmother became even more frightened, as she had never heard anyone mention such a thing before. Moreover, She had often walked this path past the bamboo without any issues. After the incident, Elfleda was fortunate to survive, but she tragically remained paralyzed for the rest of her life. She could only crawl around the house on a small chair each day. Now and then, my grandmother would visit Elfleda to help her parents with meals and chores because she felt guilty, regretting that if she hadn't invited her friend that day, none of this would have happened. That said, the past was the past, and Elfleda's parents no longer blamed my grandmother. Yet, until my grandmother passed away, she was still filled with guilt. Time went by, until one day, a nearby neighbor passing by my grandmother's house early in the morning saw her preparing to care for Elfleda. The neighbor stopped by to tell her that during the previous night, she had accidentally glanced out towards Elfleda's house while going to the bathroom and saw someone resembling Elfleda. That person was standing with their hands raised high as if praying to someone, waving their hands incessantly and wandering around in the yard, which made the neighbor quite frightened and gave her goosebumps, causing her to rush back inside and lock the door. Initially, my grandmother was bewildered upon hearing this, but she didn't really believe what the neighbor had just said. Still, she continued to visit Elfleda and chat with her as usual. A few days later, Elfleda's parents asked my grandmother to watch their house for a day or two while they went to Solvang to get fabric to sew for extra income. My grandmother agreed and went to ask for the parents' permission, which they granted. Thus, on the very first night, my grandmother witnessed a terrifying scene in Elfleda's house that she would never forget. As usual, after finishing housework in the morning, my grandmother packed her things to go take care of Elfleda. That entire day, Elfleda was alert and conversed with my grandmother quite normally, although speaking was difficult for her, almost like a child learning to talk. By night, after taking care of her personal hygiene, my grandmother went out to the bamboo bed in the living room to sleep. In the middle of the night, she was jolted awake by the sound of someone clapping bop-bop. Grabbing a kerosene lamp, she followed the sound outside to the backyard and stood peering from behind the door, where she saw Elfleda standing, her hands raised high, clapping bop-bop as if she were praying to someone in the air. My grandmother was terrified to see someone paralyzed for so long, suddenly standing and performing such a strange act without fear. But gathering all her courage, she called out her friend's name. "Elfleda, what are you doing out there?" Elfleda kept wandering around the yard like that, until she heard my grandmother calling her, suddenly stopping and turning her head toward my grandmother, who was standing in the house looking out. My mother described that my grandmother said Elfleda's face looked black as coal, with wide, white eyes, and her hair all disheveled, and she even smiled at my grandmother. She slowly approached where my grandmother was standing, walking stiffly as if someone was controlling her. My grandmother, fearing she had lost her spirit, turned and ran from the house, shouting to the neighbors nearby. When everyone rushed to Elfleda's house, they saw her running towards the thicket of bamboo near the canal. It was already well known that she had been paralyzed before, so how could she be running like that made everyone curious and somewhat afraid. So they took the risk and followed her there. Upon arriving, people searched and found her lying in the dense bamboo thicket. By the time everyone struggled to pull her out, she had already passed away, her eyes wide open and staring in a frightening manner. My grandmother, witnessing that scene, was traumatized until her death. When they held a funeral for Elfleda, they invited an elderly monk to chant prayers for her. As he passed by the bamboo grove, the monk stood there looking for a long time, mumbling words that my grandmother and everyone else could not understand. Later, the monk explained that the spirit was once a wealthy man who lived on this land. He was sentenced to behead for being accused of harboring and protecting rebels against the throne. It has been over 100 years now. He also mentioned that he had been watching Elfleda for a long time, since she was little, but it was not the right time to take her until she grew up. He waited for the right moment that the spirit mentioned to finally take her. The monk further said he had advised the spirit to follow him back to the temple to practice, but it refused, being accustomed to this land, and the monk also did not have enough spiritual power to subdue it. However, it has never harmed anyone, so no one should disturb it. It simply appears occasionally to play tricks on people. Later on, when my grandmother got married, there were no more reports about the spirit here, even though the bamboo thicket still remained. As for Elfleda, my grandmother recounted that since her passing, neither she nor Elfleda's parents had ever once seen her spirit appear in a dream, not even once. I don't know if anyone has ever heard a similar story. Personally, I believe it, because there was a time when I felt a chill down my spine hearing my grandmother, who was over 80 years old at the time, speaking in her sleep during an afternoon nap, saying, "Elfleda, are you here to take me away?" Dear friends, that concludes our story. Thank you so much for your constant support and for following the channel. I hope you will subscribe to help the channel reach 1,000 subscribers and motivate me to create daily videos. Don't forget to leave a comment and like the video if you enjoyed it.